So this, yeah, okay, this dissemination of knowledge and of kind of practice into something that becomes a more defined space from something that's extremely fragmented, like you're describing, to something that is sort of seen as not just a medium, but like a game or even a brand. This process is really what I'm interested in.
Well,
And
all of the smoking guns are there. The
okay,
Bloom family that owns TSR, because Gygax and whoever, whether Arneson or the Game Store guy or whatever, the people who were TSR in the first 6 to 8 months of its existence,
yeah,
well, that's over. By the time that article comes out, the Bloom family owns it, and they were really kind of ahead of the game in terms of trying to create a franchise.
okay, yeah.
Let's also look at the role of those magazines. Dragon magazine came out, the first one in 1975. So a lot of these sort of indications, false indications in many ways, that there was a bigger culture, a central culture there. I mean, just because
Hmm.
some Yahoo puts out a magazine from their basement doesn't mean anything except that there's a Yahoo with too much time on his hands. But what it looks like to you is that in this hobby store, there is issue 4 of Dragon magazine. Oh my God,
Mm,
this is like coming from whatever fountain, is producing
yeah,
the game.
yeah.
I have a set of videos from a while ago called Finding D&D, in which I talk about this as a religious phenomenon. And it doesn't really become a religion until later, but the way that this period is looked at is treated in religious terms, that there
Okay.
was some sort of ineffable blossoming from a central point,
Hmm.
and that anything that can identify itself with that central point, i.e., be published Dungeons and Dragons, must be partaking of and expressing it.
Are you also, because my mind immediately goes to the idea that we've kind of deified
Oh, Thorley.
these.
D&D is Jesus,
Yeah.
right? I mean, first, and it's almost creepy how well it connects. And if you look at the historical phenomena of that period of history and how
Hmm.
Jesus kind of gets made from it,
Yeah.
it's very, very similar. And then in the way people experience it, because either, work with me now, either Jesus existed back in the day when no, and we will never recover those golden days, right? That was when metaphysics walked the earth and spoke with us,
Hmm.
and we do our very best, right, to try to live up to it. That's one model. Another
Okay.
one is it's here in our hearts.
Mm.
I can't describe it, but I believe in. I mean, D&D, right? First and best. Saying it's the first and best, it's gaming's Nicene Creed.
Mm.
And then the latter one, oh, don't worry, it's coming. Next edition.
Right.
Next edition. Here it comes. It's coming. He's
Hmm.
coming. And so it's really fascinating to like talk to people, and they are literally saying these very things. And you're going, my God, I've talked to Jesus freaks at bus stations who sound like you. So
Right. Yeah.
um,
Okay.
but to go back to this 1970s thing, and it's critical to recognize that the Blooms are kicking. I mean, they're already setting up the RPGA, which is a means, a club you joined that would teach you how to do it right. And it would have special
Mm.
conventions that only you could go to. And it trained its dungeon masters, and it codified exactly how each one ran each separate adventure module. And they got trained, they had to go to classes to do this. They had to like get trained in it to become
Mm.
certified as a dungeon master by the RPGA.
Wow.
And so all this gets going during the 80s. They get a cartoon, right? Actually, quite a nice cartoon. They get a cartoon made. They get a toy line started. They're already lawfaring the hell out of everybody. People talk about the lawfare of TSR in the early 90s, but the
Mm.
Blooms presupposed, what is the word I want? Oh God, what's wrong with my language? Um, anyway, they were the precursor of that a decade before. So
Hmm.
all of those very structural elements of creating a conformist and captive audience in which
Mm.
your particular title was the real one and everything else was a grubby knockoff,
Yeah.
um, all of that was very much, being put in with verve, right, with effort. Um,
Yeah. Hmm.
and then
It,
let's also say that distributions formed. People who had been distributors for, specialized dice that nobody on this earth had either heard of yet, let alone used.
mhm.
People who had been making those things and sending them out on mail order, they became distributors for this. They were all of a sudden, they were now national or semi-national distributors for this
Mhm.
material. And so, one last thing, I'm really sorry, Eric, there's one last piece of this puzzle from
You
this
don't have to
from
be
this
sorry at all. No, this is captivating. Yeah.
and here's a huge thing. Please investigate in 1973 the Nixon administration's interaction with um, the FCC, the Federal Communications blah 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 agency, which in the United States literally has full oversight over what is produced in media. And they're the ones who do the rating system and stuff like that for television shows. And they were extremely powerful. They
Mm.
weren't appointed. Their activities were not known. They just made policy. They just did it. So the Nixon administration made a deal with the FCC that if you were a band and you advertised in an underground newspaper, you would not be featured on the radio.
How do they define an underground newspaper?
It's look it up. It's actually extremely well defined.
Okay.
These, especially in the period that I'm talking about, the late 60s through the late 70s, these are newspapers that are not just, well, basically they don't go through standard distribution.
I see.
They go through hand to hand. They go through mail
Mm.
order. They go through batches that are sent to particular organizations who then would make them available through their region, stuff like that.
Mhm.
And so, and very good examples would be the Berkeley Barb in the West Coast, or Rat in the East Coast. Those would be sort of your great big standards for what those are, but those actually were almost a bit bigger than their boots.
Mm.
I would look at the plethora, the enormous range, the whole ecology of lesser ones,
Mhm.
because it is in these newspapers that people would learn about the bands would not only advertise in them, but they would go and play at those festivals that were organized through them.
Mhm.
And who was making the logos for these bands and doing the mastheads and the cartoons for these comics, but all the same underground comic book artists who are also working, in all these other places too.
Mhm.
And so, what you did when this occurred, go ahead and look it up for yourself how all the bands that remained on the radio depoliticized. Black Sabbath never again did a song called War Pigs or anything like it,
Mm.
for example. Look at the bands that hit super big in the late 70s: Boston, Journey, not a shred of politics in them whatsoever. Look at the bands that refused to conform, like Jefferson Airplane, and look what happened to them.
Mhm.
And so, therefore, what you did, this was an extraordinary surgical strike. But what it did was it took this blossoming activity that you and I are talking about and it killed it dead in the water. Because now, where were you going to go if you were interested? A great deal by the early 80s, a great deal of the adults, including, forgive my crassness, all the hot women who were involved, were gone.
Mm.
And the only culture you had to go do this thing was the war game board game hobby, full of a
Mhm.
bunch of odd men.
It's an act of it's centralizing the culture in a
Mm-hmm.
sense. Okay.
Well, it's kind of weird because it created the new node for the role playing culture was not the larger culture with all of its um in all of its kind of amazing glory,
Mhm.
because that gets blowtorched. Now it's kind of forced to coalesce or to centralize around a piece that is not very well suited for it.
Right.
And the Blooms walk face first into this. Quite naively, they're attempting to make this, cultural effervescence out of
Mm,
what they're doing, or more accurately, a marketing empire.
yeah.
Um, they are attempting to do that, but they run face first into the fact that Dungeons and Dragons is full of tits and demons.
Counterculture, what you were describing
Yeah,
before
all of
as
that.
well.
Yeah, it's
So,
totally excessive. All of everything I've described, all role playing content at this point, is if not explicitly excessive in terms of sex and demons and things, is
mm,
intellectually challenging. It is referring into science fiction that makes you think. It is
mm,
referring into fantasy that gets you excited and do crazy things. It's very,
mhm.
very, very much not what mommy wants your kid to do.
So they have a problem in a sense. They want to
Oh, they have a
conform.
terrible problem.
They want this sort of the culture to centralize. They want all the DMs to conform to this idea, but the people who want to play this game don't necessarily want to do that.
Well, for sure, they definitely don't. And
So
not
what
only, well,
what
this
does
is,
TSR do at this point?
well, who knows what it would have done. What happens in reality is that all of a sudden its various connections start to dry up. It gets
Hmm.
by the way, speaking of licensing, probably the first big ass licensing of this entire picture. You should check into several things. One, we already have licensing into wargaming with Star Trek, Starfleet battles and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So the avenues for some of that have already been set up. But the big ass
Hmm.
one is Marvel Comics getting licensed with TSR to do the game Marvel Superheroes,
Okay.
1984. And so things are looking good along those lines.
Yeah.
But now it's 1984, it's 1985, and somebody realizes that rock and roll is very, very, very hard to take down with your little moralistic acts, right? You can do dances and get very upset and get everybody very upset with you, and maybe some
Hmm.
politicians will jump on board, but rock and roll isn't going anywhere.
Mm.
Comics and role playing are low hanging fruit. They have no infrastructural support whatsoever. They're run by a whole bunch of people who are a bunch of kind of, for lack of a better word, clueless jazz musicians.
If we were to put it into the music kind of analogy, you would say that like rock and these kinds of musical art forms or other artistic mediums have this, like you said, an infrastructure, whereas tabletop role-playing games as a medium is very, very new in this form, in this
Oh, very
place.
much so. Yes. And it was extremely vulnerable. So all you had to do was have one person say, "Oh my God, my kid killed himself because he played your devil game."
Well, and then okay, right. So I see where this is going
Right.
in
So
terms of the
TSR walks face first into that.
okay.
Do you think it's a surprise that the Blooms sold the damn thing in 1986?
No, that's definitely so because they they try in a sense to conform to make this less excessive,
Right.
but in a sense they fail.
Yeah. And also, let's not forget too that the people who are attracted to this are people who are seeking fantasy, science fiction in the deepest sense of those words.
Hmm.
The
Okay.
deeper sense that they want expansion of their experience. They want expansion of themselves. They
Hmm.
want, and this is something that is only dimly glimpsed in fandom, they want connections with others.
Hmm. Hmm.
Fandom as such is in a tailspin about that. It's defined by commerce and its loyalty to it. And so their attempt to be friends because they're fans is forever doomed.
Hmm.
Fandom, I think, is a very toxic environment. So, but we're looking for people who are, at least to some extent, trying to find this. At this point, with all the older cool people, cool is the wrong word. With all the older interesting people, right? The sort of fascinating women and the rocker guys and the bushy eyebrowed old guys who's been reading science fiction for 40 years and all that stuff. all the really interesting people, they're gone from role playing at this point. That's part of that larger surgical strike upon the counterculture, which effectively killed it.
Right. Just
So
really quickly, because these people, they don't necessarily no longer have the desire to, I don't know, expand their experience. What do they do instead of role playing?
well, the late 70s in this regard are very difficult. The capture of countercultural impulse by uh, commodified forms of achieving some transcendent or personal or at least happier goal in life is
Mm,
amazing. The birth of the self-help industry, the shift from feminism, from liberation into basically success.
yeah.
Be as successful as a businessman, as a businesswoman.
Hmm.
Um, these transitions are very fast, and the economic downturn, I think, is also involved. People became a lot less uh, experimental, or were less risk taking. Let's point out that a great deal of the people who had been involved were childless in 1972 or childless in the mid 60s, and now they're very much not.
I see. Right.
Um,
Okay. Hmm.
and so who knows? I mean, I'm sort of spitballing a number of different things, but there is a very big literature on what happens to the activism of the 70s, what happens to the excess, the experimentation. Although music continues to evolve, we know that it evolved in much narrower channels of opportunity to be in it,
Hmm.
and narrower channels of opportunity to hear it, such that what seems in retrospect a remarkably limited way to hear music, which would be whoever the DJ was playing on the radio,
Mm.
turns out to be vastly more diverse than what you would be listening to on MTV in 1989.
Right.
Oddly,
Hmm.
who would have thought, right?
Hmm. Similar,
Right.
basically the same trend is occurring in tabletop role playing, right? Like we're going
Even more
from
so. Even
the
more so.
idea, yeah.
Even more
Okay.
so. I have a class called Three Fantasies, which is specifically about how um, well, a part of it is specifically about how fantasy role playing became genre. The
Mm.
difference of genre, you see, in the way I see it, is defined by not only the codification of semiotics, right, in a
Hmm.
pack, but also, and more importantly, what it's supposed to be about. And you may be
Hmm.
well aware that when we talk about genres, they are usually a middle stage, not an original stage. If we look at westerns, for my favorite example is Western cinema. If we look at westerns going all the way back to the around 1900, and we you will see that the cinema included an incredibly broad range of political, cultural, and thematic content. Um, But when Westerns went to television in the 1950s, that's
Hmm.
when an enormous amount was codified and stamped into exactly how you're supposed to do it. All that white hat, black hat stuff comes from there.
Mm.
And so, and you wouldn't believe how many TV Western shows there were in the 60s, in the 50s, and the 60s. I mean, I look back on it. I mean, I look back at Wikipedia and stuff like that. There's hundreds of them. It was an enormous industry. And so this is a generation just before mine. People talk about growing up on westerns. That's what they're talking about.
Mm.
So but therefore, when somebody later in the 70s, like the Wild Bunch, or in the 90s, like Unforgiven, or any number of others, does something that is idiomatically a Western, but doesn't conform with that package, everyone goes, oh my God, they're deconstructing it. How innovative.
Mm.
And all I have to do is look back at, a movie like No Name on the Bullet from
Hmm.
1950 and say, dude, they did that a lot.
So whose interests are served by transforming tabletop role playing games from a medium into a genre?
Now, this is really interesting because I'm talking specifically more about D&D right now, but I am saying fantasy role playing as
Okay.
such. There's another factor involved. And there's a really good book about this, which is terrifying and depressing. In fact, I have it right
Oh,
here.
great.
It's
I
fairly
love
recent.
books like that.
Yeah. Big fiction, right?
Okay.
by
Mhm,
Dan
mhm,
Sinekin. And it is all how conglomeration changed the publishing industry in American literature. And
mhm.
it, for me, reading this is like horrific autobiography. I'm reading it very slowly because I get too angry every so often.
Oh, okay.
Because it's, and I can, and the issue of, you see, there wasn't any fantasy bookshelf on the in the bookstores. It was just
Mm,
mixed in with science fiction and whatever. And so the idea of, breaking them out into these separate categories and things was barely underway, if at all.
mm,
And instead, you end up, well, soon you end up with this idea that you have uh, a particular thing that is fantasy, and it will look like this and it will be this. You can see it very clearly in one of the first sort of, well, not one of them that's very obvious is the Shannara series, which is a Tolkien pastiche. But also, much more importantly, it goes all the way back to what happened to Conan,
mhm,
which are stories from the 30s, which have been repurposed through fans with rewrites and re-edits and fanfic, basically, all being presented as the Conan series in paperback.
mm.
And so even before the movie comes out, which is its own weird thing, you have basically a dumbed down pastiche Conan, who, if you go and in which the Howard stories look like oddballs.
Mm.
So this phenomenon occurs a lot just as an ongoing feature of culture. What's important is that the consolidation of fiction into publishers, and particularly into agents and reliable authors who will not drink themselves to death anytime soon,
Mhm.
that you can rely upon. I think it's like the publishing industry finally said, the problem with authors is that they become alcoholics, or they blow their brains out, or both.
Mm.
And
But
what can we
that's
do
not,
about that?
yeah.
Right?
I mean, I think I know where this is going. It's not so much that it's not so much that they've blown their brains out. It's that they can't write more books that we can sell.
Well, absolutely. Well, that's the biggest problem. Yeah, they don't care if you're dead or not. They care about whether you can
Mhm.
do this thing or not. And so they that's very much the case, but not sell more books, because the authors are often very happy to write more books. No, they want to sell the same book.
Okay,
They
I
want
see.
to sell the book you sold before.
Hmm.
And the authors that can do that, who for one reason or another either are so cynical they don't care, or they are basically you know functional dysfunctionals, um,
Hmm.
or they are naive, right? Oh boy, I get to write a Star Trek novel. Ooh, 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 right?
Yeah.
So, so basically, this is, if you look at what happens to fiction, something weird happens. This is at exactly the same time that people who are doing fantasy role playing are now old enough to start providing for.
Mm.
And so you have this weird thing, fiction publishing, paperback book fiction, fantasy publishing is enormous in comparison to tabletop role playing in commercial terms. But the feedback between the two is far more equal than you might think.
Mm.
So that within a very short period of time, by the Dragonlance publication, you have the idea that you would have a series of fantasy novels written as if they were a transcript of a game, even though they're not. And you would buy the game package that would take you through the events of the novels as an experience. And so you get to be like
Hmm.
a side character in them. And so do you see how quickly these things blended and started talking to each other?
Hmm. Hmm.
Dragonlance was the first big franchise along these lines. It was begun in the later days of the Bloom ownership. And it's no surprise that when the Williams took over TSR in 1986, classic venture capital dodos, um, they their whole point was that they wanted to do a Dragonlance, but you of course aren't going to do what the old guy did, right? That just shows how
Hmm.
good they were, not how good you are. you want to bring in more capital, so therefore you have to do your own thing. So they basically discontinued that, and within a few years began the Forgotten Realms series, which is the same thing on hypersteroids. I mean, just unbelievable how much content was produced, all of it bad. It is notable. Well, I will take that back a little bit. There were some people trying to do some very interesting things inside that context, some of which have persisted, but they were sort of struggling against the wind. But it is now well known that the professionals pumping out those modules, those play modules for Forgotten Realms, never played any of it and didn't care.
I think we're heading in the direction of the crisis that TSR finds themselves in.
Well, there's been several crises. At this point, TSR hasn't made any money for anybody. Flagship of the industry. Right. Are you kidding? This thing's a fucking albatross. The Williams blow through their entire fortune that they inherited so hard, and they and by the mid 90s are $37 million in debt in early 90s dollars. And so they've been, just like the Blooms, they're frantically trying to divest themselves of this.
Okay, so coming up to, I don't mean to skip any time periods. If you want to go back,
I only want to point out just how tightened distribution had become by this point. You should look into two companies which actually are connected at the hip: Alliance for games and Diamond for comics.
Okay.
You would not get into a game store or a comic book store without being distributed by that proper distributor. You just wouldn't.
I see.
And they operated very much just like in big fiction. You know, somebody would want to put out a fantasy novel, and the one question was, well, does Cecily like it? Like Cecily, one person basically runs the entire content of this bookstore category for the whole nation.
Wow. Okay.
So it's the same thing with comics. Bud, God, what was his name? Buddy, somebody or other in Alliance was like this huge gateway. If he liked your comic, then Alliance would carry. So, and liked meaning, you know, he thought that this was something that he could make money off of. So this is very important, that this is when all role-playing games have exactly the same size, exactly the same number of pages, are built on the supplement treadmill. We're going to keep, they basically shifted to a periodical model of publishing at this point. And although nobody's really admitting it, the whole point is that you're trying to compete for distributor loyalty. The distributors actually held the debt of the industry at this point. So if something didn't sell, they were the ones who absorbed that. And so this is when it was codified. You released a game at Origins, and then you came and you sold it to customers, so the distributors would have it. And if they picked it up, you would pitch to the distributors at the Origins convention, and then you would go and sell it to fans or consumers, basically, at Gen Con.
Okay, right.
So all of this was really locked down.
I really, really like the framework that you described before about these kind of three influences that sort of together made the conflux that sort of
that is the activity, right?
Which is again like this idea of fantasy, sci-fi, literature.
But look what it's becoming now. Look what it's become now. It has become, the medium is lost. If you look at the actual instructions in the book, and I can trace you from the Avalon Hill publication of RuneQuest in 1983, and we can go through things like all the superhero games and especially Call of Cthulhu. And then we can look at what TSR is doing with these mandated campaigns that you take people through. The medium is lost. The game master becomes an avatar of the published content to deliver it to an audience. And you have to become a compliant player. You have to be cooperative. You have to be, and then the rules shift. The rules totally shift in regard to this. And the few people who didn't get the memo, who keep struggling to put out fun stuff because they play it, and
Mhm.
romanticizing the early days when people put out fun stuff because they played it, because they don't know any better, are being
Mm.
eaten alive.
Right.
And so they cannot succeed. It is not financially possible for them to do what they think is the case. I said this to Noon, you might have seen it, that there is this enormous belief that uh, commercial success is, meritorious. That you
Mm.
get out there, and if people like your game, more people, they'll talk to other people, and more people will play it. And that means they will go and clamor at the game store, we want more of this game, we want more of this game. And the
Mm.
game stores guys all over the place turn to their distributor and say, oh, we want more of this, the masses demand it. And the distributor, neutral facilitator that they are, then go and order more of that game from that publisher. So basically, everyone thinks this is the way it works. So that when TSR floods the shelves with all of its various new Dungeons and Dragons for second edition in 1989, and
Mhm.
floods the place with as many products as they can about this, you think, oh, look at how many people must love this game.
Mhm. I see. Yeah.
So, and don't forget the era we're in. We're in the second term of Ronald Reagan. We are
Oh.
in we are in the world of deregulated banking and venture capital.
Mhm.
We are in the world of basically you are brilliant, you do a brilliant thing, the people fall all over themselves with amazement at your brilliant thing, and you become rich, and you've self-actualized your very person into the culture, and everyone likes you, and you love yourself now, and you're rich.
Mhm. The best of all.
You would not believe how many people believe this shit to this
Mm.
day.
Mm.
When people say the most popular role-playing title,
Mhm. Mhm.
any of this, it's garbage
Right.
then, garbage now.
Right. So we've got this kind of bastardization of the sci-fi literature kind
Mm-hmm.
of origins. We've got a consolidation, a heavy consolidation of the rules, like the mechanics, the kind of the war gaming side of things. But then we've got the counterculture, the the
Well,
counterculture
it's
that came.
it's a little bit odd. I think that the counterculture as such struggled greatly. Remember how I said punk like 5 years to be co-opted?
Yes.
Well, this is continuing to happen. Hip hop shows up 2 years,
Right.
I would say.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so the point is that it is getting harder and harder to be a counterculture.
I see. Right.
And if you wanted to go to somewhat later, I would go to the queer culture.
Mm.
That's where you're going to find it. And I would say that there is a neutered, very, very depressingly bland notion of what fantasy is and what fantasy role playing is, what science fiction is, what science fiction role playing is. There's you they were so, remember, distribution, when it becomes the central judgmental note of what is or isn't the thing, they're all
Mm.
risk averse.
Yeah.
Gen Con institutes a rule that if your rules create confusion between player and character, they won't carry it.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's because everybody's terrified of the Satanic Panic, who has no political power whatsoever and are completely weak. But
Hmm.
we're talking about very risk averse and very isolated people. We're talking about people who are completely, and this is a bullied subculture, most of us.
Hmm.
They're the cringe and the closeting is exactly what they've done.
Hmm.
Nobody
Hmm.
admits they play role playing in the late 1980s, and I was out and proud with my role playing. It
Mm.
was astonishing to people. Other
Hmm.
gamers like, oh my god, you can't tell people.
Right. So I do want to go forward a little bit because I'm really,
Yes.
really hoping that we get
Oh, you can see that
2001 just
we've hit the
3.
mid 90s roughly by now.
We have.
Yeah.
We're making it. But speaking of the mid 90s, I think I might be jumping the gun just a little bit, but this is also when we start seeing the internet coming into play and
Yes.
open source.
Mhm. Well, the internet phenomenon in this regard did something very important. it blew apart for many people the idea that to play D&D was a single thing. Because when you were sitting in your foxhole playing D&D with your buddies, and you thought that you were, a flickering flame of Christian truth under Roman oppression,
Right.
right? And
Uh,
and you knew there were others out there, and you're going to keep your candle alive, partly in solidarity with them.
mm.
And then you all discover each other on the internet, and who let all these enemies of God into the tent? Right? Because they all do it differently. And they have no institutional memory at all, so they don't even know much about these different editions and stuff. And most people are playing, so again, some weird cargo cult at their table,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody's marked up their books and done it their way. Don't forget that Dungeons and Dragons was never a very well consolidated and conceived rule set. There's one little sequence, the Holmes to the Moldvay to the Menser publications, which were actually a side branch, a parallel branch to what we call Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. They are actually the most coherent of the bunch. Most of the rest of it is completely improvised, thrown together, desperately trying to preserve IP mess.
Okay.
Compared to any other role-playing game, nearly every version of Dungeons and Dragons is an extraordinarily poorly conceived basket of gunk. Even when the people doing it were very good, and you can see some very good work in there, but they're forced to incorporate masses and masses and masses of things that the owner does not want to let slip away in terms of ownership.
Because of the intellectual property?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I see.
So when we get to the 90s, you have a very crazy situation where people now finally have admitted you're never going to make any money off this. You're going to try to build IP, speaking of IP. So people going into role-playing now are attempting to get into television, into movies. They're trying to build a marketing point that they can, pitch to the Hollywood guys. Look at our cool vampires and werewolves. Of course, the guys in Hollywood laugh at you and say, oh, yeah, we're not interested in that. Then you go away dejectedly. Or maybe you get to do your little TV show, your half a season TV show based on vampire, which they did. And you walk away dejectedly, and then you turn around and they've released Underworld. They're not going to take it, they're just going to do it anyway. They love your proposal. They just don't love you.
They don't need to pay you for that.
Right. Actually, White Wolf actually won that court case against that studio.
Oh, they did. Okay.
Yeah. But if you look, you will see that tabletop role-playing content has been mined for pop culture steadily, other pop culture steadily the entire time. We have actually been the mutation, right? The genetic mutation of popular culture this whole time.
Yeah.
So, just think about it for 2 seconds and you'll realize it's true. So when we look at the situation of TSR is declared bankrupt, or very close anyway.
This is 1997, I believe.
Well, the sale is in 1997.
Okay.
The meltdown, right, is obviously preceding it.
Okay, right. Yes.
And
yes.
so, I would do best to print out something I have here, but I will give you the broad strokes first. The team of people represented by Peter Adkison, Ryan Dancy, and a few other names that you probably know, were collectively extremely clever in buying TSR, which at this point had acquired the Pokemon license, I believe. They were able to consolidate a great deal of properties, including Magic the Gathering, which they had already. And they were able to consolidate this and then sell off the pieces that they wanted to in a package to Hasbro. And then divvy up the other pieces as the people desired. For example, Peter wanted Gen Con. Peter wanted, he says, I want to run Gen Con. That's my goal here. I don't need to keep TSR. I don't need to keep Magic the Gathering. I want that. Other people said, well, I want this, I want that. So what they did was they made a package, they consolidated. The sale to Hasbro was in the works almost immediately. There was not a WotC phase of D&D,
Mm-hmm.
and then Hasbro comes along and buys it. No, the flip was in process the entire time. Peter walked away with Gen Con, and various people, had like magazines and stuff get farmed out to different places. Hasbro really, really wanted Pokemon, and they did not want TSR.
Mm-hmm.
They did not give a shit about Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, anybody looking at the financial history of Dungeons and Dragons would say, keep that rancid mess away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Peter
But
said, no.
they also had Magic the Gathering, as you mentioned.
Yeah, they definitely want Magic the Gathering.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Peter said, no, you got to take TSR with it.
Yeah.
So that's why they got it.